Hi there, how are you? Thanks for joining us today. We're thrilled to share this week's edition of Only in America. This time, the fear of immigration and why the best response to President Trump might be rooted in theology.
Even if our politics say that we're divided, our faith maintains and affirms that we are in fact united. And it also points to where we're called to go in the future. If we don't realize that, we're the aliens.
And as Homeland Security promises to address the Central American migrants at the border, voices from the so-called caravan.
¿Quieres llegar a Estados Unidos?
Sí, quiero llegar a Estados Unidos.
I want to arrive in the United States because I want to give my daughter a better future.
And an asylum-seeking poet, first denied and then accepted, competes for a national prize.
Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, still in my breath of life, I will confess, I love this cultured hell that takes my youth.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. Much of today's immigration debate plays out in the context of our southern border. Whether it is the president calling for a big, beautiful wall, or deploying the National Guard, or claiming drugs are literally being thrown into the U.S., Americans are led to fear the border. But Father Dan Groody has a completely different perspective. I met Father Dan last week in South Bend, Indiana, where I spoke at the United Religious Community 2018 prayer breakfast. Father Dan is a Catholic priest and an award-winning author and film producer. He's also Associate Professor of Theology and Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame and the Director of the Global Leadership Program at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. He draws on years of work helping migrants and refugees both internationally and in the U.S. His work, he told me, began in Central and Latin America, but was inspired by a story from his high school days.
I was an exchange student in Uruguay and Argentina, and I remember being exposed to the military dictatorships at the time. And to be honest, it was a whole new world. One of the children of the family that I stayed with was a desaparecido, and he just simply disappeared one day. And I was awakened just to the injustices that were going on to the people living there. And so I think two things happened at that time. One, I became more aware of the bigger issues going on in the world around me, and so it was really the issue of justice that came to the forefront. But also the issue of the inner journey came up because I really couldn't talk to anybody because I was just learning the language. So that led me to a deeper conversation with God. Mm-hmm. And from that kind of unfolded a lot of my life, both in terms of understanding global affairs, but also in understanding the kind of inner journey. Mm-hmm. So as my life unfolded, I went to college, and after college I entered the seminary just one step at a time, trying to understand where God was leading me. And it wasn't a part of the master plan for me, both in terms of becoming a priest or entering into the migration issue, but I think it claimed me or found me more than I found it. And when I was first ordained, I was assigned to work in a Hispanic parish. Mm-hmm. So having worked in Latin America, I wanted to continue that in working with Latinos in the United States. One of the first families I met was living literally in two very small rooms of a person who was a maid at Notre Dame. And they were all crammed in, and they'd all just come across the border. They were all undocumented.
Mm-hmm. What year was this?
This was in 1992.
Yeah.
But something of both their suffering, but the love that was there, claimed me. And I thought that they just had such a way of banding together and of also giving expression to the strength of their faith. And from that point on, I knew this issue was going to be very important. So I finally, afterwards, I worked in the parish for a number of years, and I mean, I can remember going through everything from, trying to help them find jobs, dealing with their immigration status, to actually helping them go through baptisms as well as births. A number of them had children along the way, and often in emergency status, they would pull me in. Mm-hmm. And but also I can remember marrying them, baptizing them, doing their quinceañeras, and so on. So my life became intertwined with the migrant community. But in time, I went on to do graduate studies, and I wanted to study spirituality. I really wanted to study the inner journey. But as I studied Latinos, that got me more and more into the issue of immigration. So I was out in California, mm-hmm. working in the Coachella Valley, And it was a very vibrant Latino community, and I really wanted to know what brought it to life. Many of them were immigrants, and many of them had come over from Mexico. And as we were doing retreats with them, they actually would go back to their home countries. And so that got me into the roots of their communities and the immigration challenges that they faced. So I saw some of the root problems that led people to migrate. So in time, this inner journey, outer journey dynamic began to emerge, but also between the academic world and the grassroots. And I often say that when I was in the migrant camps, people didn't care that I know, they just wanted to know that I cared. Yeah. Whereas people in the academic world didn't care that I cared, they just cared that I know. And I was trying to figure out, like, where do I fit in this world? But then finally I figured out, no, actually I'm on the border. And I'm really in the border between these two worlds. And I guess for the last 20 years since I've been in the academic world, try to build that bridge between the academy and grassroots. Because I've loved my experiences, being in the grassroots. My work really builds out of the life of the people. But I've also found that in the very complex and vast array of immigration issues, there's also a need for a theological perspective. Because when everything else is taken away, all you have left is God. And the migrants know that. And so the question is not how do I speak about God to them, but how do they really experience God and how do they speak about it. So a lot of my work is kind of going to borders in different parts of the world to try to understand the narratives of migrants and what's going on with their outer journey, but also what's going on with their inner journey.
So you use the term border a couple different ways, right? There. As you travel to different borders, what are the ways that you see kind of the similarities between somebody's inner and outer journey, crossing borders, whether, again, the inner or the outer border, and what are the differences?
When I was 8 years old, I can remember finding a pamphlet on the ground of a rest area, and it had a very provocative question. And it said, did you know that you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches? I didn't really know what it meant, but it was very provocative, and I opened it up, and it actually said that the distance between the head and the heart in most people is only about 18 inches. And that God was not someone to just understand cognitively, but someone to encounter in the depths of one's being. And I would maintain that the deeper migration and more difficult one is really, really moving from the head to the heart. The Native Americans have said, like, the long journey of human life is really moving from the head to the heart and back again. And maybe I would say even more, it's the head to heart to the feet and then back again.
Why?
Because people, I think, are afraid to go into places of vulnerability and even to some of those deeper recesses of who we are. I teach a course called The Heart's Desire and Social Change. Which deals with this inner development and outer development. It's really such an experience and a beautiful experience to journey with people into these places of who they are in the depths of their being. But I've also realized is that there's a lot of stuff there that's hard to deal with. And I would even ask myself, why does this issue of immigration press so many buttons? And I don't know, really. I mean, it's a constant question, but I wonder sometimes whether or not it triggers a vulnerability in us that frightens us, and that in doing so we're afraid to see in them our own vulnerability, and we react to it when we see it. But unless we've gone to that deeper migration within us, it's hard to really welcome people, and it's hard to really see that something of what they're going through is something of who we are.
How do you help somebody grapple with their own fear so that they're not afraid?
A lot of times, even with my own students, we do a lot of work on the true self and the false self, and like, how do we differentiate between what other people want us to be and who we, in our own inner depths, want to be? And that's not an easy process. And sometimes I can see students come up to that border, and it's like, what if everything that I feel like I want to be is not what others told me I should be? And what do I do with that? And sometimes they stall out right at that place, and it becomes very troublesome, because then the question is, what is this going to cost me to be authentic? And so sometimes you just have to stay in the fear. So one of the things that we do is we do some exercises on mindfulness and focusing, which is not to eliminate the fear, but sometimes just to sit with it. And it's really to move through it. I think the challenge is to just sort of name that fear, be with that fear, but also help people move through it.
Do you find a similar fear or a different fear among the migrants that you've gotten to know?
Yeah, I think sometimes I just find such remarkable courage in the migrants. I mean, they, like us, would not choose necessarily to go through that experience. And, it's interesting kind of walking with migrants who've crossed the deserts, say in the American Southwest, and you look at their situations, and they don't actually kind of go into the desert to have a dark night or like John of the Cross, or they don't actually go in there to go through deep purification processes. But what is interesting is to see the parallels. When everything is stripped down, you get to the core of our humanity. I remember really once going down there, and I met this migrant who was just come across the border 3 or 4 days. You know, he needed a ride, and he flagged me down. And at one point, I said, "What's it like out there?" And he didn't know who I was. And he says, "Oh my gosh, it was awful." He says, "I was walking with some friends. I lagged behind, and they left me behind." And he says, "Then I got lost in the desert. I got disoriented, and I couldn't find my way." And I said, "What did you think about?" And he said, "You know, I realized that the only friend I have is God, and that God is the only friend who will not abandon me." You know. And so I said, "Well, who is God for you?" And again, he didn't know I was a priest. He didn't know anything about me. And so he says, "You know, all I could think about was Job." He said he lost his health, he lost his friends, you know, he lost his family. He says, but he never cursed God. And he says, "That's who I want to be." You know, and I mean, it's just so disarming. But I mean, the kind of authenticity and the clarity with which he spoke that, I think, you know, rivals that of the great mystics. And so there is a purification process that goes on with that, and they had to confront their fears and confront death. But the remarkable courage they had to go through that, I think, was just inspiring.
How do we help the public understand why that migrant is taking that journey? Because I think that most people believe that somebody's coming to take something from them.
Right. You mentioned this somewhat earlier, and I think really this question of grace. I mean, the question is, what is our fundamental disposition in the world? Is it a world of scarcity, or is it a world of grace? Are we living out of God's abundance, or is it just simply that I got to possess everything I have? These are deep spiritual questions, and I think that's why a big part of my work targets not just something like policy, but the imagination. It's the moral imagination, and a big part of it is really the spiritual imagination. How do we understand who we are before God? And if my operative imagination is, these are my things, I need to protect it, I need to keep somebody else from taking it, and it's all mine, that's one way of understanding it. If my spiritual imagination is, everything I have is a gift, nothing I own in a complete way, at best I'm a steward and not an owner, that's a different way of living and being in the world. And that's rooted in our spirituality. And so I think we need to kind of help people work with their fears and acknowledge those fears and walk with those fears. But we have to know that we're more than our fears. And whenever we just are literally guided and driven by those fears, we make bad decisions. This is also spirituality. If we're fear-mongering, we're not really going to arrive at the right place.
So then, where do you see the nation's immigration debate going? Where do you see the world's migration debate going in this really difficult environment of fear?
Well, I've said this to one White House official. I said, look, these policies right now are really deporting the soul of America. These are inhumane. These are actually making us worse, not them. Not only depriving them, but it's actually really making us less into who we are as people made in God's image and likeness. But we're not unique in that sense, in a way. Maybe we brought it more to the forefront with our current policies, but I do see xenophobia, and I do see the fear-mongering, the utilization of migrants for political gain going on around the world. And really, it's something that's been happening from the beginning. One of the things I usually do with people is I kind of show them, you know, the Genographic Project, which really looks at, you know, just through a little bit of saliva, you know, you can actually trace back your migration heritage 80,000 years. So I show them my paternal ancestry from the migration kind of path from the last 80,000 years. I said, this issue is in our genes. And it's in our spiritual genes as well. I mean, the great monotheistic faiths, I mean, from Abraham on down, it's woven into our spiritual genes. But if that's the case, also maybe we have to understand ourselves as being migrants in this world. And maybe it's when we kind of lock ourselves into a gated community of our own fears that we actually die. And it's then that we suffocate and really keep from becoming, as you were saying, that our lives are in movement. And it's when we move that we grow. And so I think we have to recover a sense of the appropriate sense of movement. But I'd have to say there's a tension in this in spirituality, because spirituality has to deal with these tensions. We are seeking a home, but we also want to move. And I think part of the nature of our lives in this world is that we have to deal with that tension between wanting to be rooted somewhere and being at home, but also wanting to move. And perhaps the indigenous traditions of Latin America know this best, because they say the heart is a physical organ with a mystical quality, and it's always searching, it's always in movement. And I think it's always moving to something greater. And from my perspective, it's really the kingdom of God. I mean, we're moving to a greater realization of what we're called to be, and that the kingdom names that call not only to move in that direction, but also to break down walls and to build bridges.
So this is perhaps an unfair question. That's a pretty tough preface, right? The look on your face, like,
there's
oh no.
There's a lot of unfair questions in this world.
So, let me put it this way: it's a tough question. I think it's a tough question. How do we translate the journey of the migrant, the journeys that we all go through, in the context of this immigration debate and the fear, to actually having a rational policy debate? Because ultimately, we do need better immigration policies. Right now, I think there's a wall between somebody's emotion when it comes to immigration and their brain when it comes to immigration. How do we break down that wall so that we can actually have a rational approach to immigration policy?
A number of years ago, I was giving a talk near the Mayo Clinic, and one of the nurses from Mayo Clinic said to me, she took this image of the heart and the head, and she says, let me go a little further on this. Mm-hmm. She says, the carotid artery actually brings the blood from the head to the heart and then back again, and it's a necessary process to be purified. And she said that if you were to cut off that circulation, she said that all the toxicity of the blood would actually kind of lead to death. In many ways, this kind of made sense to me, because I think what we have is such a toxic debate about migration. It has to go through this process of both thought and emotion to get to a deeper understanding. I think we tend to poo-poo that, oh, this is too emotional, this is bleeding heart, whatever this may be. But really, for the indigenous communities, the heart is not just a center of emotion, it's the center of deepest understanding. And so we need both kind of rationality, practicality, kind of stuff like this, but we also need this deeper sense of who we are as relational beings, and how our emotions can also be revelatory in that process. So like the blood circulates from the head to the heart to be purified and then back again, we need to do this more comprehensive process. But I also think I map this out a little bit in other ways of trying to see how people have a place to be heard first. And I always say migration is an incredibly complex issue, and at the same time it's an incredibly simple issue. I think you need to have both those intentions so that people can have a way of being heard. But then what breaks down the walls often is that experience of encounter. Yep. Pope Francis says this again and again, the culture of encounter creates a sense of relationship. I didn't get into this from some ideological perspective, not even some academic perspective. It was an encounter with people that I knew. Yeah. And when I really started seeing the counter narrative going on in the culture, I said, this isn't
But
true.
This gets to what we were talking about last night. Sorry to interrupt, but the importance of Lampedusa, of his Lampedusa sermon. So let's talk a little,
right?
Yeah, and because I think that's symbol, right?
Right. Because as you've mentioned, the heart of this question is who is the other, but the heart of the call is really how to move from otherness to oneness. So when the Pope went down to Lampedusa, it was the first pastoral visit he made after being elected Pope, after hearing the story of a tragedy at sea of these migrants and how they were dehumanized and really not only ignored but cut off, really their lifelines were. He went to that island and he celebrated Mass on the island, but he also used a chalice made from the remains of a refugee boat. So what does it mean to use a chalice in the Eucharist that's made from the remains of a refugee boat? I would maintain that it actually brings out the big picture of really what, in this case, what Catholicism is trying to communicate to the world. And that is its movement from our brokenness and alienation to our call to oneness again. So from otherness to oneness, from brokenness to unity, all of this is sort of what the big picture of Catholicism is about. And so this chalice has great symbolism in it, because the Eucharist is really a borderlands where the human and divine meet, but it's also where the brokenness comes together and the promise of communion is realized. The American Lampedusa is really every year down in the southwest border, there's a border Mass where half the community is in Mexico and half the community is in the United States, and then they join the altar together at the fence. And so what does it mean to celebrate the Eucharist in that context? And I would maintain that really it's a sign that even if our politics say that we're divided, our faith maintains and affirms that we are in fact united. And it also points to where we're called to go in the future. If we don't realize that, we're the aliens.
So the name of the podcast is Only in America. So for every guest, I ask them the same question. Finish the sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America could you have a place that could bring so many immigrant communities together and really try to become one. We're not the only ones with immigrants, but it is at the heart of our creed. And I think if you really see that we've been stitched together through the immigrant narrative, probably unlike any other country in the world today. We are both a country of laws, but we are a nation of immigrants. And so only in America could we see that a gift and a blessing, and not just something that we need to be afraid of and fear. And so I think really in the end of the day, the immigrants today call us to what we can become. And in many ways we've forgotten that story, and maybe it's time to really rediscover it.
Father Dan Groody is Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. There's more in his books, his documentaries, and all of his work at immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, why not subscribe to Only in America? Coming up, my thoughts on the week so far.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
On Tuesday evening, a U.S. district judge ordered the administration to reopen the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or DACA, to new applications. But let's be clear. The judge delayed the ruling for 90 days in order to allow the administration to make a better case of why the program should be ended. Judge John Bates, a George W. Bush appointee, said the wind-down of DACA was, quote, arbitrary and capricious. He also accused the administration of providing meager legal reasoning to support its decision. As I told the New York Times, tonight's decision by Judge Bates verifies the Trump administration failed to prove the DACA program is illegal. Either Trump finds another way to end the program, tossing hundreds of thousands of young people into deportation proceedings, or he works with Republicans and Democrats to find a legislative solution that secures our border and ensures dreamers continue contributing to our economy. But let's turn to rural America, where an intense immigration debate is playing out. Lauren Schmoke is a lawyer in Omaha, Nebraska. She's representing 12 out of 27 Hispanic men who were pulled from construction sites and arrested by officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Many of them have been in the U.S. for more than a decade, with families and mortgages and, well, American lives. Here's what Lauren told reporter Taylor Barth from the ABC affiliate in Omaha, KETV.
The purpose is to create fear. I mean, the purpose of this is to create fear, to make people afraid to go to work, to make people afraid to leave the house. It's very difficult to win immigration relief. The denial rates for applications in immigration court are incredibly high, especially here in Nebraska.
Let's get back to that border. A few weeks ago, in a special episode of Only in America, we learned about a so-called caravan of women and children fleeing violence in Central America. Well, this group has made national headlines as a subset of the migrants have made their way to the U.S.-Mexico border in order to claim asylum. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen has already laid down the law. She said in a statement that they will face prosecution, detention, and deportation should they enter the country illegally. Well, Secretary Nielsen, the fact is, these migrants are most likely to turn themselves into Border Patrol officers in order to apply for asylum. Here's what Alex Mensing, project coordinator for Pueblos Sin Fronteras, told me a couple weeks ago.
These are people who understand that there are risks to traveling through Mexico and to applying for asylum in the United States. They even understand that they will very likely be indefinitely detained in the United States by seeking asylum. They know that. And yet they are still motivated by the fear of returning to their home countries so much so that they're willing to go through that process. And we have something to do with that. I think another thing it's important for people to understand is that U.S. policy has contributed to the conditions in Central America that cause people to flee. And so the idea that people should just fix their own country, which is one of the common things that we're hearing kind of coming from the right, they've been trying. But the U.S. government, for example, is supporting a military dictatorship. The Honduran people voted this man out of office, but he stole the election through electoral fraud. And the United States government is supporting that.
Finally, a fun story. Alan Manga arrived in Maine as an asylum seeker from Zambia. He lived in a teen shelter and enrolled in Portland's Deering High School. Then he won the state poetry competition. But to advance, the National Endowment for the Arts requires competitors to be U.S. citizens or permanent residents, neither of which Alan has yet received. So a federal judge reviewed Alan's case and ruled he would be able to compete at the National Poetry Out Loud Finals. Here's Alan reciting Claude McKay's America to NPR's Ari Shapiro.
Within our walls, we're not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly I gaze into the days ahead and see her might and granite wonders there. Beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking in the sand.
While Alan didn't win the competition, he certainly won our hearts. That's this week's show. Emily Chow and Regina Medina are the producers of Only in America. The executive producer is Kathleen Farrell. From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani. Talk to you next week.